Alpha King Voron. Calith didn't want to be in the Grand Hall that morning. The midwinter tribunal had been scheduled without his knowledge, slipped into the court calendar like a blade between ribs. He sat on the obsidian throne, jaw tight, watching the council of stewards arrange themselves with the smug precision of men who believed they controlled the room. They did. That was the problem. The visiting envoys from the northern reaches lined the gallery, their eyes sharp and assessing. This wasn't governance. This was theatre, and Voron had been cast as the lead without reading the script. Matron Archivist Myra Stalking stepped forward, her silver robes whispering against the marble floor. She held a scroll bound in red wax, the kind reserved for blood oaths and permanent decrees. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice carrying the false warmth of poisoned honey. "The matter before us requires your judgment. A purity hearing, as prescribed by the ancient codes." Voron's fingers curled around the armrest. Purity hearings hadn't been invoked in decades. They were relics, designed to humiliate and control under the guise of tradition. "Who stands accused?" he asked, though he suspected the answer would taste like ash. The heavy doors at the far end of the hall opened. 2 oath scribes entered, flanking a young woman whose head was bowed beneath a ceremonial grey shawl. She moved with deliberate slowness, each step measured and obedient. Too obedient. Voron's instincts flared. This wasn't fear. This was training. "Serapha Nivana," Myra announced, "daughter of Beta Bram Eltovar." Voron's gaze snapped to the woman. He knew the name but barely remembered the face. Bram's daughter had been a quiet presence at court functions, always on the periphery, always invisible. She stopped at the center of the hall, her hands folded in front of her. The shawl concealed her features, but Voron could smell the tension radiating from her skin. Not panic. Control. "If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother once said I'd never reach 1,000 subscribers. But I believe stories like this, the quiet ones, the forbidden ones, the ones that burn slowly in the dark, deserve to be heard. Subscribe to Midnight Stories and help turn whispered tales into something that can't be ignored. Comment below what time and where you are watching from now. Let's continue." Myra unrolled the scroll. "The charges are dereliction of bloodline duty, spiritual non-compliance, and failure to uphold covenant standards. The law requires confession and acceptance of corrective discipline." The words were carefully chosen, wrapped in ritual language that made cruelty sound like procedure. Voron scanned the council members. None of them looked surprised. They had rehearsed this. "Serapha Nivane," Myra continued, her voice rising. "You are commanded to kneel and accept judgment." Serapha knelt without hesitation. The movement was too smooth, too practiced. Voron's gut twisted. One of the oath scribes stepped forward and removed the ceremonial shawl. The hall went silent. Her hair fell in dark waves over pale shoulders, but it was her skin that stole the breath from the room. Faint scars traced delicate patterns across her upper back and collarbone, thin lines that intersected like careful geometry. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old enough to be forgotten. This was repeated harm, administered with precision. Voron's vision narrowed, his wolf clawed at the edges of his control, demanding he move, act, tear apart whoever had marked her. But he didn't move. Because the envoys were watching. Because Myra was watching. Because this entire scene had been designed to provoke exactly this reaction. "Your Majesty," Myra said, extending the scroll toward him. "The judgment is prepared. You need only confirm and seal." Voron looked at the document. He didn't take it. "I require clarification," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "What evidence supports these charges?" Myra's smile didn't falter, but something cold flickered in her eyes. "The evidence is sealed by covenant law, Your Majesty. Your confirmation is a formality." "Then it can wait until I review the facts." The room shifted. Council members exchanged glances. The envoys leaned forward. Serapha remained motionless, her gaze fixed on the floor. She didn't plead. She didn't speak. She simply endured, as if she had learned long ago that silence was the only safe language. Maera's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Your Majesty, the court already possesses documentation bearing your seal. This hearing proceeds under your prior authorization. Voron froze. His seal. On a document he had never seen. Maera smiled, and the trap closed around them both. Voron couldn't sleep. The tribunal had ended hours ago, unresolved and seething with unspoken threats. He had dismissed the court without delivering judgment, buying time he didn't know how to use. Now he paced the royal wing, his wolf pacing with him, restless and furious. Then he caught it, a scent anomaly threading through the sterile air of the corridors. Blood. Faint, but unmistakable. And beneath it, something sharper. Fear. Controlled and buried deep. He followed it to the service wing, a place he rarely visited. The halls were narrow here, lit by dim oil lamps that cast long shadows. At the end of the corridor, a door stood slightly ajar. Voron pushed it open without knocking. Serapha stood at a small basin, her back to him, scrubbing at her arms with a coarse cloth. She wore a thin shift that exposed the latticework of scars across her shoulders. Fresh marks darkened the edges of the old ones, still raw. She was shaking, but her movements were methodical, practiced. This was ritual, not panic. She sensed him before he spoke. Her entire body went rigid. Slowly she turned, and when her eyes met his, Voron saw something that made his chest tighten. Not surprise, recognition, as if she had been expecting punishment to follow her here. Your Majesty, she whispered, and her voice was steady in a way that felt wrong. She should have been startled, defensive. Instead, she straightened, bracing herself like someone who had learned to endure inspection. Voron's control fractured, not into the protective instinct he expected, but into something darker. Possessive fury coiled in his chest, hot and dangerous. His wolf snarled, demanding he mark her, claim her, tear apart whoever had done this. But he recognized the trap. The council wanted him to act on instinct, to touch her, to blur the lines between protection and possession. He forced himself to stay still. Who did this? It doesn't matter, she said quietly. It matters to me. Then you're the only one. Her gaze flicked to the door, calculating distance, escape routes. She thought he was another threat. Voron exhaled slowly, reining himself in. He noticed the pattern now, the deliberate spacing of the scars. This wasn't cruelty. It was administration. Ritual geometry designed to enforce compliance through pain. I'm ordering a healer assessment, he said, his voice rough. Under royal seal. Private. No council. Serapha's eyes widened, and for the first time, genuine fear broke through her mask. No. You need medical attention. I need you to leave me alone. Her voice cracked just slightly. Please, don't summon my father. Don't report this. Don't... She stopped herself, biting down on the words. Voron stared at her. She wasn't protecting herself. She was protecting someone else. Or something else. Why? She didn't answer. She simply turned back to the basin, dismissing him with silence. Voron left before his control snapped entirely. He made it 3 steps down the corridor before Jax, his head enforcer, intercepted him. Alpha, Jax said quietly. You need to know something. Covenant law. If you interfere with a bound subject without proper authorization, custody transfers to the covenant holder. Voron stopped cold. What? The council, Jax continued. If they claim she's under covenant discipline, and you intervene improperly, they can take legal possession of her. Permanently. The trap wasn't just for him. It was for her, too. Voron found Beta Bram Eltavar in his office just before dawn. The man sat at his desk, staring at a stack of unopened correspondence, his hands folded too neatly in front of him. He didn't look up when Voron entered, didn't startle at the sound of the door closing. He had been waiting. Your Majesty, Bram said, his voice hollow. Voren didn't sit. Your daughter has scars that match Covenant discipline patterns. Explain. Bram's jaw tightened. He didn't deny it. That alone told Voren everything and nothing. It's complicated. Uncomplicate it. I can't. Bram finally looked up, and Voren saw something he hadn't expected. Not guilt, fear, deep, bone-settled fear that had nothing to do with the man standing in front of him. Please, Your Majesty, let it alone. Voren's anger sharpened. Your daughter is being harmed under my roof, and you're asking me to ignore it? I'm asking you to trust that I know what I'm doing. Bram's voice cracked. She's alive. That's what matters. Alive isn't the same as safe. In this court, it's the best I can offer her. Bram stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the stone floor. You don't understand what you're walking into. If you push this, if you demand answers, it won't just be Serapha who suffers. Voren stepped closer, towering over the older man. Are you threatening me? I'm warning you. Bram's hands trembled. The council has leverage, not just over me, over everyone, over the crown itself. The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Voren studied Bram's face, the lines of exhaustion carved deep around his eyes, the way his shoulders curved inward as if bearing an invisible weight. This wasn't a man protecting his daughter. This was a man obeying orders. You're compromised, Voren said quietly. Bram didn't deny it. He simply exhaled, a sound like surrender. Voren made his decision. Effective immediately, you are restricted from contact with Serapha. For her security. Bram blinked. Your Majesty, I'm not arresting you. Yet. But you don't get to be near her until I understand what the council is holding over you. Bram nodded too quickly, too easily. Relief flickered across his face, and that confirmed everything. A real father would have fought, demanded access, defied the order. Bram accepted it like a man grateful to be released from duty. Voren turned toward the door, but Bram's voice stopped him. Your Majesty. The Beta's tone had gone flat, defeated. If you pull the wrong thread, the crown will bleed. They've been weaving this web for years. You're standing in the center of it, and you don't even know. Voren looked back. Then help me see it. Bram shook his head slowly. I can't. They'll know. And if they know, Serapha won't survive the night. Voren left the office, his wolf snarling in frustration. The Beta wasn't loyal to the council. He was terrified of them. And if Bram Eltavar, a man who had stood beside Voren in war, was this afraid, then the council's power wasn't just legal. It was absolute. The royal healer, an elderly woman named Thessa, examined Serapha in silence. Voren had brought her to a private chamber in the medical wing, far from the council's eyes. Serapha sat on the examination table, her posture rigid, her face empty of expression. She had agreed to this only because Voren had framed it as a command, not a choice. Thessa traced the scars with careful fingers, her lips pressed into a thin line. When she finally stepped back, her expression was grave. These are ritual compliance marks, Thessa said quietly. An old Covenant enforcement method. Each line corresponds to a specific infraction under binding law. The spacing, the depth, the placement, it's all documented procedure. Voren's hands clenched. Procedure. Yes, Your Majesty, this isn't cruelty, it's administration, legal correction, sanctioned by Covenant authority. The words landed like stones. Voren had expected to find evidence of abuse, something he could prosecute, something he could stop. Instead, he had found a system, and systems were harder to kill than men. Can it be undone? Voren asked. Thessa hesitated. Physically, the scars will fade with time. But the Covenant itself, breaking enforcement procedures without proper authorization, triggers automatic transfer of custody clauses. If you intervene incorrectly, she could be legally claimed by the Covenant holder. Serapha spoke for the first time since entering the room, the matron archivist. Thessa nodded grimly. Most likely. Voren looked at Serapha. She met his gaze, and he saw the calculation behind her eyes. She had known this. She had been living inside this trap for years, navigating rules designed to crush her. "Why didn't you tell me?" Voron asked. "Because you can't fix it by breaking things," Serapha said flatly. "You'll only make it worse." Thessa excused herself quietly, leaving them alone. The silence stretched, taut and brittle. Voron wanted to rage, to tear the council apart, to burn every piece of paper that gave them power over her. But she was right. Brute force wouldn't work here. Serapha reached into her sleeve and pulled out a small folded piece of parchment. She handed it to Voron without a word. He unfolded it. Inside were 3 names, oath scribes, and a date from 4 years ago. "What is this?" Voron asked. "The beginning," Serapha said. "If you want to fight them, you fight the records, not the people. The records are the weapon." Voron stared at the paper. She had just handed him a thread to pull, a way into the archive, a chance to dismantle the machine from the inside. "Why now?" he asked. "Because I'm tired," she said simply, "and because you're the only one who's tried." Voron nodded slowly. He would follow this thread. He would pull until the entire web collapsed. But that night, Jax delivered a message that made his blood run cold. "Maera Solkin filed a sealed decree with the Envoy Council," Jax said. "She claims your proxy signature authorized Serapha's discipline 4 years ago. She has documentation." Voron stood frozen, his own seal, his own authority, weaponized against him. The Council hadn't just trapped Serapha. They had trapped him too. The archive occupied the oldest wing of the Frost Court, a labyrinth of stone corridors lined with shelves that reached into shadow. Voron entered alone, against Jax's advice. This wasn't a battlefield. This was Maera Solkin's kingdom, and in here, his claws meant nothing. Maera stood at the center of the main hall, surrounded by towers of ledgers and scrolls. She didn't look surprised to see him. She looked prepared. "Your Majesty," she said, inclining her head with perfect courtesy. "I wondered when you would come." Voron didn't waste time on pleasantries. "You claim I authorized Serapha Nivana's discipline. I want to see the document." Maera smiled, the expression cold and surgical. "Of course." She gestured to a table where a single scroll lay waiting. The wax seal bore his crest. The signature looked disturbingly like his own. Voron stared at it. "This is a forgery. Legally, it is indistinguishable from the original," Maera said smoothly, "which makes it true. In this court, truth is what can be proven on paper, Your Majesty, not what you remember." Voron's jaw tightened. "You're offering me a way out." "I'm offering you stability. Stop questioning the Covenant procedures and this document disappears. The scandal vanishes. The envoys leave satisfied. Everyone benefits. Except Serapha." Maera's smile didn't waver. "She is one girl. You are the crown. The choice should be simple." Voron turned away from her, scanning the archive. The sheer volume of records was overwhelming. Centuries of law, precedent, and documentation stacked in perfect order. But something felt wrong. He moved closer to the shelves, running his fingers along the spines of ledgers, missing pages, duplicated seals, witness lists with names crossed out and rewritten in fresher ink. Maera had been editing history, not once, repeatedly. "How many documents have you altered?" Voron asked quietly. Maera's expression didn't change, only those that required correction. Voron found a ledger dated 23 years ago. He flipped it open, scanning the entries. And there it was, Serapha's name, listed under a restricted category. Sovereign derivative, maternal line. He looked up sharply. "What does this mean?" Maera's composure cracked just slightly. "It's an outdated classification." "Answer the question." "It means her mother carried a bloodline claim. A minor one. Irrelevant." Voron's mind raced. A bloodline claim. Restricted. Hidden. The council hadn't been punishing Serapha for breaking rules. They had been suppressing her to prevent something else entirely. "I'm ordering a formal oath audit," Voron said. Maera's eyes hardened. That is unwise, Your Majesty. An oath audit examines all oaths, including yours. It places your reign under scrutiny. You would risk your legitimacy to save one girl. Yes. Maera studied him for a long moment. Then you are a fool. Voron left the archive, his mind churning. That night, Serapha came to him in the royal study. She had heard about the audit request. If you do this, I testify publicly, she said. Not in private chambers, not behind closed doors. Publicly. Voron nodded. Agreed. She hesitated, then spoke carefully. There's something you need to know. My mother's line carries a right of challenge. If I invoke it, I can legally contest the crown's legitimacy. Voron froze. You could destabilize the throne. Yes. And the council knows this, Serapha nodded. That's why they've been breaking me. Not for morality, for survival. Voron understood now. The council wasn't afraid of her suffering. They were afraid of her power. Voron's wolf had been clawing at him for days. The instinct to protect, to claim, to mark Serapha as his own, pulsed through his veins like fire. He hated it, not because it was wrong, but because he understood now what it meant. Jax brought him the final piece of the puzzle late one night, a brittle parchment fragment recovered from a discarded Covenant manual. Alpha, Jax said grimly. The tribunal wasn't just theatre. It was bait. Voron read the clause 3 times before the full horror of it settled. Any alpha claim, physical touch in a protective context, public defense, marking, triggered an automatic Covenant transfer. The subject would become legal property of the Covenant holder, not the alpha. The council. They wanted me to touch her, Voron said slowly. They were counting on it, Jax confirmed. The scars, the public humiliation, the midnight discovery, all of it designed to provoke your instincts. Voron's hands curled into fists. Every protective impulse he'd felt, every moment he'd wanted to shield her, had been the trap closing around them both. Serapha arrived an hour later, summoned by his message. She stood in the doorway of his study, guarded and tense. You knew, Voron said. She didn't deny it. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? Because I wasn't sure you'd believe restraint was possible. Her voice was steady, but her eyes held something raw. Most alphas don't. Voron felt the weight of that truth. She had been testing him, watching to see if he could control himself, if he could be more than his instincts. The council wants me to claim you so they can own you, and through you, the succession challenge. Yes. They've been playing this game for years. Serapha stepped further into the room. They've been patient. They knew eventually you'd notice me. They just had to make sure when you did, you'd react exactly the way they wanted. Voron stood, his jaw tight. Then we give them the opposite. What do you mean? I distance myself, publicly, completely. The words tasted like poison, but he forced them out. I treat you like any other subject under investigation. Cold, formal, no protection, no favor. Serapha's breath caught. For a moment, genuine fear flickered across her face, not of him, but of being alone in the storm. Then she straightened and the mask returned. That will make me vulnerable. I know, but it's the only way to avoid the claws. Voron stepped closer, careful not to touch her. Meanwhile, you prepare your testimony. Gather every piece of evidence you have. When the oath audit begins, you speak, publicly, and you burn them down. Serapha studied him, weighing the risk. Finally, she nodded. I'll do it. But Voron, she used his name for the first time and it sounded like a warning. If this fails, I won't survive the fallout. It won't fail. You can't promise that. No, Voron admitted. But I can promise I'll make sure your voice is heard, even if it costs me the crown. Serapha looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable in her expression. Then she turned and left without another word. The next morning, a council edict was delivered to every corner of the court. Serapha Nivane was scheduled for a final compliance hearing in 3 days, to be held before the envoys departed. The wording was formal, but the message was clear. This was the endgame. Either she would be silenced forever, or the entire system would collapse. There was no middle ground left. The grand hall was suffocating. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Envoys from 5 territories pressed shoulder to shoulder, watching with the hungry attention of predators scenting blood. Voron sat on the obsidian throne, his face carved from stone, his hands gripping the armrests with barely contained tension. Serapha stood in the center of the hall, unshackled, wearing a simple grey dress that exposed the scar lattice across her shoulders. She had refused the ceremonial covering. This time, there would be no hiding. Myara Solkin began with the formal charges, her voice smooth and practiced. But before she could finish, Serapha spoke. I invoke my right to testimony under oath audit procedure. The hall went silent. Myara's smile faltered. You have not been granted. The audit is active, Serapha interrupted, her voice clear and steady, which means I have the right to speak, unless the council wishes to violate its own protocols. Voron didn't move, didn't interfere. This was her battlefield now. Serapha turned to face the envoys. 4 years ago, on the 7th day of winter, 3 oath scribes entered my family's residence under covenant authority. Their names, Erix Thorn, Dalin Vess, and Mira Kellen. They carried documentation bearing a proxy seal they claimed was the king's authorization for corrective discipline. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. One of the northern envoys leaned forward, his expression darkening. The seal was a forgery, Serapha continued, but the law didn't require my family to verify it. The law only required obedience. So, for 4 years, I submitted to ritual compliance marks administered every 3rd month, 68 sessions, documented in the restricted archives under covenant enforcement, file category S7. Myara stood abruptly. This is a distortion of legal procedure. The healer's report confirms the pattern, Serapha said, not looking at her. The dates match archive records. The witness lists have been altered, pages are missing, and my mother's bloodline classification was suppressed under a restricted seal that should have been disclosed during any tribunal involving my family. The northern envoy stood. We use the same covenant structure in the Reaches. If forgery was involved, this isn't isolated. Another envoy from the Eastern Territories rose. Our archives have similar irregularities. The hall erupted. Myara's control was slipping. She turned to Voron, her voice sharp. Your Majesty, this woman is legally unsound under covenant. She has been deemed non-compliant. Her testimony is inadmissible. Voron stood slowly. The room quieted, every eye on him. If her testimony is inadmissible, Voron said, his voice cold and deliberate, then let the oath scribes present the original seals. Let the archives be opened. Let every document bearing my authority be examined. Myara's face went pale. Your Majesty, that would place your reign under scrutiny. Yes. Voron descended the steps, stopping in the center of the hall beside Serapha. He didn't touch her, didn't claim her. He simply stood as a witness. If I am guilty of authorizing this, then I will answer for it, but so will everyone else. The envoys erupted in approval. The council members exchanged panicked glances. Myara's voice turned venomous. Then I invoke emergency covenant protocol. For the stability of the realm, custody of Serapha Nivan is hereby transferred to the council pending investigation. Guards moved forward. The court fractured, half rising in protest, half frozen in compliance. Serapha didn't run. She stood perfectly still, her eyes locked on Voron. And Voron realized with brutal clarity the next choice would decide everything. The guards were 3 steps from Serapha when Voron's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. I invoke royal legitimacy audit under sovereign override. The hall went silent. Myara turned sharply, her composure cracking. Your Majesty, that protocol hasn't been used in 2 centuries. I'm aware. Voron's voice was cold iron. Under sovereign override, all covenant enforcement is frozen until the Crown's authority is verified through independent examination. That includes custody transfers. The guards stopped. Confusion rippled through the council members. Maera's face drained of colour. You would risk civil fracture for this, Maera hissed. I would risk my crown for the truth. The room erupted. Council members rose in protest. One of the stewards shouted above the noise, "The king is compromised. He's ruled by obsession, not reason." "He's protecting a traitor bloodline," another called out. "She carries the right of challenge. If he sides with her, she could remove him legally." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and damning. Every eye turned to Serapha. The northern envoy leaned forward, understanding dawning. Is this true? Can you challenge his legitimacy? Serapha met Voron's gaze. For a moment, the entire hall held its breath. She could take the throne now. She could use this chaos, this fracture, to invoke her mother's bloodline and dismantle everything. Instead, she turned to face the assembly. Yes, she said clearly. Under Frost Court law, I carry a right of challenge through my maternal line. I could contest the Crown's legitimacy. Maera's expression shifted to something close to triumph. She thought she had won, but Serapha wasn't finished. I'm not invoking it to seize power, Serapha continued. I'm invoking it to rewrite covenant law. The system that allowed my suffering isn't unique to me. It's been used to control, suppress, and break people for generations. I'm demanding reform. Oversight councils, transparent enforcement, spiritual and ethical review of all covenant procedures. The hall went silent again, but this time the silence was different. Thoughtful. Uncertain. Voron stepped forward. I accept her terms. Maera's eyes widened. Your Majesty, you cannot... I can. And I will. Voron's voice carried absolute authority. If my reign was built on a system this broken, then it needs to be torn down and rebuilt. I place myself under the same scrutiny as everyone else. One of the Eastern envoys stood slowly, then another. They weren't applauding. They were acknowledging. This wasn't weakness. This was strength through accountability. But Maera wasn't done. She turned sharply to her oath scribes, her voice low and urgent. Enact contingency protocol. Now. 2 scribes slipped from the hall. Jax moved to intercept, but Maera's guards blocked him. Voron's blood ran cold. What did you just order? Maera smiled, brittle and venomous. Insurance, Your Majesty. If the archives are to be examined, then certain records must be preserved from misinterpretation. Voron understood immediately. She was destroying evidence. Outside the hall, shouts erupted, the sound of shattering glass, panic spreading through the corridors. Jax forced his way to Voron's side. Alpha, Maera's faction is moving. They're igniting panic in the lower courts, claiming the crown has fallen. The kingdom is fracturing. Voron looked at Serapha. She stood at the center of the chaos, unflinching. This is what truth costs, she said quietly. Voron nodded. Then we pay it. The archives burned for 3 days before Jax's enforcers regained control. Not all of them. Maera's loyalists had been efficient, destroying entire sections of covenant records before they were stopped. But enough survived. Enough to prove the pattern of forgery, suppression, and systematic abuse that had rotted the Frost Court from within. Maera Sulkin was found in the lower vaults, surrounded by ash and half-burned ledgers, still trying to erase her legacy. She didn't resist arrest. She simply looked at Voron with cold, calculated eyes and said, You've destroyed more than you've saved. Voron didn't answer, because part of him knew she was right. The court reconvened under armed guard. The envoys remained, but the atmosphere had shifted. This wasn't theatre anymore. This was surgery. Serapha stood before the assembly, holding a single document. Not a scroll bound in ceremony, but plain parchment covered in her own handwriting. Voren recognized it immediately, the reform proposal she had been drafting in secret for weeks. The covenant system cannot be abolished, Serapha said, her voice steady. Too many families, too many territories depend on its structure for inheritance, protection, and order. But it can be reformed. She held up the document. Oversight councils with rotating membership. Transparent seals that require witness verification. Spiritual and ethical review of all enforcement procedures. And most importantly, witness protections for anyone who reports abuse under covenant authority. A steward from the Western Territories stood. This would strip noble families of enforcement power. Yes, Serapha said simply, because enforcement power without accountability is just cruelty with paperwork. The room stirred, some in approval, some in fury. The Northern envoy spoke. And what of Myera Stalking? What punishment do you demand? Serapha looked at the woman who had marked her, tortured her, tried to erase her. Myera stared back, defiant even in chains. Exile, Serapha said. Strip her of title and archive access. But don't execute her, because killing her won't fix the machine she operated. It will just make someone else the villain. Myera's expression flickered. Surprise, then something close to respect. Voren stepped forward. I accept the proposed reforms, fully, without amendment. He turned to the assembly. I also place my own reign under the new oversight structure. If the Crown authorized harm, even unknowingly, then the Crown must answer for it. The hall erupted in argument, but Voren raised his hand. The alternative is civil war. Choose. One by one, the envoys stood. Not all of them, but enough. The reforms passed. Weeks later, after the envoys had departed and the court had begun the slow, painful process of rebuilding, Voren found Serapha in the archive hall. She stood among the shelves, cataloguing what remained, her hands ink-stained and her expression distant. You changed the kingdom, Voren said quietly. I changed the law, Serapha corrected. The kingdom will take longer. Voren stepped closer, careful not to touch. The pull was still there, sharp, undeniable, dangerous. But he had learned restraint. What happens now? Serapha looked at him, and for the first time, he saw something other than armor in her eyes. Exhaustion, relief, uncertainty. I don't know. I'm not Beta's daughter anymore. I'm not a victim. I'm not... She stopped herself. Luna, Voren finished quietly. I can't be, Serapha said. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Claiming me now would undo everything we just fought for. People would say you reformed the system to possess me, that I manipulated you, that this was all just... I know. Voren's voice was rough, but one day when the dust settles and the reforms hold, I want you to know... Don't, Serapha interrupted gently. Not yet. Let me just be Serapha for a while. Let me figure out who that is without chains or covenants or anyone's claim. Voren nodded. It hurt, but it was right. Then I'll wait. Serapha's lips curved into the faintest smile. Good. She turned back to the archives, and Voren left her there, surrounded by the truth she had fought to make visible. Outside, the kingdom was fracturing and reforming, struggling under the weight of accountability. Voren's control was gone, the illusion of absolute authority shattered. But as he walked through the frost court, past the empty throne and the uncertain faces of his people, he understood something fundamental. He had never deserved the crown through dominance. He deserved it now, through surrender, through making himself answerable, through stepping aside so that someone braver than him could force the kingdom to face itself. And maybe, one day when Serapha no longer needed to prove she could stand alone, she would choose to stand beside him. But that choice had to be hers, freely made, without covenants, without claims, without the weight of a system designed to cage her. For now, Voren would rule a broken kingdom and try to make it worthy of her. That was enough. Sarafa proved that the most dangerous weapon isn't claws or crowns. It's the courage to speak truth to a system built on silence. If this story reminded you that justice isn't about heroes saving victims, but about survivors forcing the world to change, leave a comment below. And if you want more dark romance stories where power is earned through sacrifice, not domination, subscribe and hit the bell. Thanks for listening. See you in the next tale.